Okay, so I'll say something very brief. So I generally agree with a fair amount of what Kai said in his formal remarks anyway, and I benefited from them quite a bit, and I thank him. The first thing I just wanted to say is that this is so what I was doing was a thought experiment. I don't necessarily embrace all that was involved in the stuff that I said a few minutes ago, but it seems to me that these are, that the thought experiment poses an interesting set of challenges for those of us in the just war tradition, especially those who have supported the forfeiture model. Very quickly, at one point, I guess I would disagree with Kai, who seems to embrace, at least in the printed version that he sent me of his remarks, a sort of collectivist model of responsibility for soldiers. I don't think that we can properly view soldiers as participating in a plot to take the lives of others, but we've talked about this a fair amount already today, and so we could go around that again, I suppose, but I'm fairly squarely on the side that doesn't think that's the right way to think about it. In fact, I think most soldiers haven't participated in the forming of the plot, and they're often pretty much forced into participating, if participating is the right word at all. I also just have a quibble, I guess, with Kai about the way that he wants to amend some of the things that I say about necessity. He said in the printed version, anyway, without thereby sacrificing other important ends. But in the human rights view, these ends should be subjected to proportionality assessments themselves. Just because they're important ends is not sufficient, I don't think. But I think he's right to worry about this point. And I'll just stop there. Okay. Keep your hands up. It's gonna. Yeah, it's going to be the ones who have spoken a lot already. How's that? I support that. Okay. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I have down, see if I've got everybody, Adil, BJ, Dick, Giovanna, Saba, and Jeff. Did I miss somebody? No, let's just go down that list then. We may actually get through everybody, unless people want to add in. Okay?
So Larry, I really enjoyed your talk. I think you make three ethical claims that are pretty plausible. And I want to suggest... So I think you make three ethical claims that I think are reasonably plausible, but I want to suggest that maybe you don't rely on international human rights law because I don't think it helps you, and I think it commits you to things that you probably don't believe, although maybe you do. So the three claims are, first, that liability to force should be based on one's individual characteristics and behavior, not group membership. The second is that unnecessary harm to combatants is impermissible. And the third is that that there is such a thing as disproportionate harm to combatants. And I think all three of those are quite plausible. I think the first two are true, I think, and the third one is possible. But I don't think human rights law really helps you much and may hurt you in one way. So it doesn't help you because, so even the language in the Red Cross guidance about unnecessary harm to combatants, that's still within the framework of international humanitarian law. Right? The idea is that even though there's no specific rule of war, of the law of war, saying you can't inflict unnecessary harm on combatants, there's a background principle of humanity. And so if there's no military necessity to harming combatants, humanity dictates that you not do that. That's still within humanitarian law. You don't really need human rights law to get you there. Similarly, human rights law doesn't really say anything about wide proportionality, as we understand it, collateral harm. It just doesn't deal with that issue at all, and so it doesn't really help you necessarily to deal with that. And then with respect to liability to force, international human rights law is very restrictive, right? It's basically the criminal law standard. You can use force to prevent an imminent threat of basically lethal or either death or very serious bodily injury. It's a very narrow standard. And so when you look at the standards in international humanitarian law, membership in a state-armed group, you challenge, right? Continuous combat function, it's your role in the organization to plan or carry out attacks. Seems like you're probably going to need that for anything like armed conflict. But even the narrowest one, direct participation in hostilities, is still much broader than imminent threat of death, right? Taking explosives to the front line or taking weapons to the front line is direct participation in hostilities. But it would not satisfy the human rights law standard of imminent threat of death. So I think going the human rights law route, it doesn't really help you. It commits you to a much narrower standard than you probably want to endorse. And so I think it might be best for you to just go with your ethical claims and make a straight-up moral argument.
Right. Good, thanks. Yeah, so I was worried that there were people in the room who actually did know some of this. So in fact, as I said at one point, but I tried to bury it in my remarks, some of what I said was controversial about where human rights law is going. There is I think Adil would agree, there's a debate within the human rights community about how far to push some of these principles that have been, and in fact the ICRC has been engaged in a sort of internal debate about this themselves, about how far they think they want to go. But you're right, that the particular document I quoted from, which is now fairly old, doesn't go as far as I indicated, but there are more recent things that the ICRC has said that would go further. But the point I'm making is not a sort of argument from authority where it matters particularly what the right interpretation is of this, but rather it was just to fuel the thought experiment that there is this worry that's somewhat parallel to the worries that some of us have been bringing to the just war tradition. But you're absolutely right. I mean, these are, after all, these are lawyers we're talking about, right? So the worse than having two philosophers in the room, of course, two lawyers, there are going to be 4 opinions at least circulating. So I agree. I do think that the view about necessity coming from the ICRC, for instance, has been radically changing quite recently, and that it does actually work better for me than you indicated. But we could have a fight about the text and whatever that probably will leave everybody else out. But it's also hard to say in law, I think, and this is why nobody lets me teach much in the law schools except jurisprudence, I think it's really hard to say sort of what the current state is of international law on a lot of these matters anyway, because there are so many courts that are issuing opinions that are not, there's no sort of hierarchy of courts to deal with. So, you've got things like the Israeli High Court making a statement, and that doesn't stand in any particular relationship with the International Court of Justice or with the International Criminal Court. So there, what I was doing was, and so my last point on this is just that I was cherry picking, it's true. I was picking things from the extant debates in international law to try to make more plausible what I thought was, in some respects, just a kind of thought experiment when I started, and then I just kept finding more and more texts that seemed to support it. But I take almost all that you said as right. And so in the end of the day, I think it's fair enough that, given my bent, I'm not going to rely too much on this. International law for me is not a source of what the lawyers call lex lata, that is what the actual law is, but rather lex ferenda, that is what the law should be. And so that's kind of what I was trying to do. But thanks. BJ.
Just a real quick question. This will not answer your whole paper's conclusion, but I'm wondering if you think it could possibly be a partial answer to the objection you're raising on 2C, which is that you complain that just war theory today does not take individual rights of all soldiers seriously, at least in part because they think of soldiers as a class. I'll just mention this as well. So maybe as a partial mitigation of that, at least for revisionary just war theory, what do you think of this idea? I've suggested that instead of a class of soldiers, you think of like subdivisions of soldiers. So like first degree combatant, second degree combatant, third degree combatant. And those are derived from the best you can do to correlate different kind of groupings of liability amongst a group of unjust soldiers. And then those would in turn correlate to different ROEs, different ways that you engage those different classes of combatants. And before you object and say, now wait a minute, that doesn't solve the issue at all. If the issue is that you need to respect individual rights, moving from one class to a bunch of classes, that doesn't fix it. Fair point, but two quick maybe ways to mitigate that a little bit would be the first to say that this is just a heuristic. Like you could do this as just a way of doing a little bit better at respecting rights, right? Getting a little closer. So it's not tracking morality perfectly because you'd have a degree of liability across all individuals, but it'd get closer. And the second is that there's only so many ways you can engage anybody, right? There's a finite number of ways you can engage any enemy combatants. You can kill them, you can try to disable them, you can try to capture them, you can try to get around them. And so if there's a finite number of ways you can respond, then maybe that can correlate to a finite number of subclasses of first and second and third degree combatants. And maybe that would better respect individual rights. And I think that option's available to revisionists just war theory.
Good. Right, so I hadn't thought of that. It's a nice idea. Have you written this somewhere? If you have, please send me the paper or whatever. That's great. So as I think I indicated, although maybe I didn't say it clearly enough, that criticism is mainly addressed to folks who follow Walzer. And I think that, so my views on this keep changing all the time, and I don't know if that's true for other people in the room or not, but I don't have any sort of settled views. But I really do take quite seriously Jeff's point in Killing in War about how many restrictions there are and on the forfeiture. And so it looks to me just very hard then to see how we're going to be justified in doing this, unless there is some subgroup way of doing this, I suppose, where you can sort of single out classes of combatants, not in the sense that they are, well, I guess you want to say that they're all to be treated the same then, is that right? So that's what's going to happen?
They'd be treated differently. The idea is that you would have some evidence on which you can judge, at least in broad swaths, the differing levels of liability or different degrees of liability amongst the subclasses. So Gerhard Overland also suggests something like this, right? With the Iraqi army, you could have said the Republican Guard, perhaps we should treat them a little differently than like the conscripted soldiers. Right. Great.
Okay, so this is going to be unsatisfying because it's going to be just projecting in. But so we're just finishing the final chapter of this proportionality book, and what we suggest is that there are 4 significant thresholds, and then you can think about how to treat folks who have crossed one or another of these thresholds, and all pretty much the same within that category. So I guess it has some of the same similarities, and that is, I think, the way that things are going in international law right now, right? So that you've got this really this sort of top category where you've got combatants who are under fire, and those folks have quite a bit of permissibility in terms of what they're allowed to do to the enemy. And then you have just normal, as it were, folks engaged in an armed conflict who are not under enemy fire, and that's the permissibility is going to be slightly less, and you keep on dropping until eventually. I think you're going to have categories that are like folks who are defending some national objective that's quite serious. So, defending against terrorist attacks, for instance, are going to have a different level of different threshold level for proportionality than folks who are in full-scale armed conflict. But it's not going to be dropping all the way down to the human rights standard, which is the most restrictive, and that is where we treat it as if there is no difference between others. It's a peacetime standard, where basically, as someone said a minute ago, it's the criminal justice standard. So I generally support that. I don't think that's quite the same as what I was thinking of, though, and that is that I think what in some cases anyway you seem to need is to be able to say of all of these folks who were potentially who are being targeted by whatever the military strategy is you're adopting, it looks like you've got to be able to be relatively clear that those folks all have the same liability to be killed. And having satisfied the threshold consideration is often not going to be enough yet, I think. So we've figured out how permissible we're going to be in terms of proportionality, but we haven't yet figured out anything about necessity, for instance. And on my view, you've got you've got to satisfy necessity before the proportionality stuff even kicks in at all. And in many of these cases, it seems like it's very hard to say that this particular soldier, it's necessary to kill him in order to save my own life, or even to preserve the life, as it were, of our unit. And that, I think, soldiers are facing on the front lines all the time. It's one of the things that we have as a legacy from Walzer, this worry about, you know, the naked soldier and so forth. And I think that still is relevant to these debates. You know, is that soldier someone who it's necessary to kill in order to preserve my life? It's true we've crossed over into the threshold in general, the proportionality threshold that gives us quite a bit of latitude here, but if it's not necessary to kill that person, then we're still not justified in doing so. So necessity is actually doing as much work for me, if not more, than proportionality in all of this. But you're right, that is one way to go that helps. It doesn't, and it may save some of the potential battlefield situations from being declared unjustified use of force. Of course, the contingent pacifist position that I've defended elsewhere now, and I'm trying to figure out how to defend in a broader way, admits the possibility that there could be these just wars. So what the contingent pacifist says is well, depending on the version, it's highly unlikely, or it's so unlikely that it's just not a good bet to go with. And there are various versions of it floating around at the moment. So somebody can come on board with what you're saying and still not be convinced that it's going to save enough, or even any of the current wars, so that they're justified. Does that help? Yeah. Okay. Dick.
I think that I'm unsympathetic to contingent pacifists. I mean, there'll be logically possible worlds in which pacifism is correct, but in anything like our world in modern times, I don't think contingent pacifism is very plausible. And I think that holds even if, as we should, you let the idea of the apt target for violence in war, you know, it becomes, you know, this very stringent, you know, this culpability requirement. So just being an innocent aggressor, that doesn't make you an apt target, right? So it's culpability. It's culpability, and then the other factor is that killing you makes a serious difference to reducing an unjust harm that's being threatened. But given that nations do bad things in the world, suppose that, you know, I'm a member, I've joined the military, or I'm going to join the military, and the nation engages in an unjust war. It doesn't really matter what exactly my fine-grained causal contribution is, because if the nation is engaged in an unjust enterprise, in order to defeat the unjust enterprise and, you know, and save people from injustice, you have to defeat the military force. You know, pretty much you have to disable or kill a lot of the enemy soldiers. Otherwise, the nation isn't going to give up. And it doesn't really matter what the fine-grained contribution is. You know, it's not just the people at the front line, or the people that are delivering them bullets, the people that are playing karaoke and stuff, you know, in the way in the background. They can get mobilized later. My father, quote-unquote, participated in a war where he kept the books for a little unit stationed in Newfoundland, where I think they were hunting seals or something. The forgotten unit. He never got within 1,500 miles of a battle. But if he was fighting an unjust war and he was culpable, I think he's an apt target. You know, that is, killing him would help bring it about that the, you know, he's culpable, and killing him helps bring it about that the injustice is averted. It's pretty much a continuous function, I think. That is, it doesn't really matter what your particular causal contribution is. So the fact that the soldiers on their side can't get fine-grained about what's your contribution versus your contribution, I just don't think that matters. I think, you know, the more of them you kill, the more chances that the unjust threat will be averted. So we can be individualist. We don't think that soldiers as a class are liable, but I still think, and I still think that, and I think it's very hard. And I think in the modern times, you know, it's very hard not to be seriously culpable when your nation fights an unjust war. If it's a democracy, you can read articles by Larry May and Jeff McMahon and so on, and figure it out. And if it's a dictatorship, you know, I mean, you can't trust what the dictators say, for God's sake. You know, there's no free speech. You know, Nobody but Arneson is allowed to talk. You can't trust the dictator. You know. So I just think, you know, again, it's possible, but I just don't see it. Maybe. So let me just I invite you to move
sure.
from contingent pacifism to logically possible.
Yeah, and I've been going back and forth about that myself in my own writing. So I don't, as I said, I'm not committed yet to any of this. I guess, Dick, the problem for me, though, I agreed with almost all that you said, except that I'm still not seeing how necessity features into it. So that you would reduce the likelihood that this attack would succeed doesn't seem to me to satisfy the principle of necessity. I think the principle of necessity is much stronger than that. And so I'm not persuaded yet from the way that you were going anyway. You know, I'm also, you know, worried about, you know, my father died a couple of years ago, and we used to have these conversations all the time, and he was stationed out here, you know, and it was the old Monterey Hotel for the war, you know, learning how to be, you know, a radar specialist, you know, and the way he tells the story, he was put on a ship once and he got seasick, and they said, okay, we'll never do that again. So then he got to stay basically on the beach for 2 years of the war, and then got the GI Bill coming out of it. You know, so you know, was my dad you know, could you target my dad because of the role that he played? I mean, I just don't see it. I mean, I don't see that there's any connection whatsoever. Sorry. Well, so in order to show that he's and, you know, use your favorite vocabulary about this, liable to be killed, it does seem to me that you're going to have to show that it's necessary that he be killed in order to accomplish whatever it is that you think is the just cause that's behind all this. I don't think that killing my dad, who was never really did learn, as it turned out, radar you know, for his 2 years stationed at the Monterey Hotel, I don't see how he could possibly be thought to be someone whose death was necessary for the war. So that's one point. But secondly, I guess, as I said, I think it makes a difference whether it's necessary to kill the person versus necessary to disable the person. And I think that would make a huge difference in terms of how people on the ground, the ones that I'm sort of worried about in this proportionality book, view things. I just don't think that wars are being conducted today with that kind of distinction in mind. All of the weaponry that folks are trained into is of a different kind. And then I follow David in the point that he made, David Roden, earlier, that you know, we're not coming at this with a sufficient view about trying out diplomacy and you know, way earlier. And if we're not, then it's then we haven't satisfied last resort, and there's, you know, for me, there's a last resort ad bellum, but to a certain extent, necessity in bello tracks a kind of last resort as well, and I think that if you haven't satisfied that, then I don't think this rationale is going to go through. In the end of the day, though, I agree with Dick, that a lot of this comes down to you know, looking at specific cases and trying to figure out whether, in fact, this war today could be justified, or whether there's something very much like it that could happen tomorrow that would be justified. And that's just precisely the conversation that I think we should be having. And I think the folks who are going to stay committed to a version of just war theory are going to think that there are some, not even a significant number of them, but at least some, and some of us who are tempted by going the contingent pacifist route, as we examine one after another of these cases, come away thinking that it's hopeless. But I still, you know, I'm going to hopefully finish this book on pacifism by the end of the year or so, and probably the conclusion is going to be something like what you just indicated, and that is I'm still not sure whether I think that's the right way to go, but it does seem to me that an awful lot of these arguments move us in that direction. Oh, I'm sorry, I've been going on too long. Okay, well, I have two on the list. How's that? Can we do that? Okay, Saba.
One was to Kai regarding the
good.
claim that we haven't forfeited a right. and the reason for thinking this is that you can't kill someone, you can't kill a culpable aggressor if doing so does no good. But I presume that the right under question here is a complex right. It's a right not to be killed when doing so is necessary to prevent the sort of harm that the culpable aggressor is imposing. And that's one small point. The other point was for Larry, and that's, I had a question about this notion of incapacitation. It reminded me of something that I think it was Francis Cam said when Osama bin Laden was killed, and you had all these people in the media who were rejoicing over this. And there was this discussion as to whether it's appropriate to rejoice over the death of someone, even if someone is as evil as Osama bin Laden. And she wrote this thing in some popular, New York Times or something. And she said that what we should be rejoicing over is the fact that he was incapacitated, not over the fact that he was killed. So if the only way to incapacitate someone is to kill someone, is this sort of double effect going to find purchase on your view? Is that would that be violating their right? So if we only have a right to incapacitate them, and the only way to do so is killing them, would that violate the right of the person who we're killing?
No, I was suggesting that if the only way that you could incapacitate was to kill the person, then in those cases I'm willing to say that it's justified to do so. I'm just denying that that happens very often, or that we can separate the cases where that's clearly justified from those where it's not. But in the case of Osama bin Laden, by the way, there was a nice discussion about whether he should have been given the opportunity to surrender, and a similar debate going on about, I think rightly, about drone strikes, and whether we should be trying to capture those folks rather than simply to wipe them off the face of the earth with this massive use of force. And I think in both cases, I'm strongly on record, both in the popular press and in the journals, as saying that we have an obligation to make sure that we've shown that was impracticable, or for all intents and purposes impracticable given the costs involved. But even in the Osama bin Laden case, from what I can tell, and of course I don't have access to the classified material on this, but it looks like they could easily have captured him.
I'm just assuming a case where that isn't possible. The only way to incapacitate him is.
But then I would agree. Yep. Kai, where's Kai? Oh yeah, okay. I thought there were one of the questions that Sabas was for Kai. I don't know whether he. So Jeff's the last on my list, and I think we've got, by my watch, 5 minutes, so go ahead.
Okay, both my points are quick. One is about incapacitation, and the point is just this, that incapacitation is the right thing to aim for depending on the length of time for which a person will be incapacitated. But if incapacitation just means that that person is unable to continue trying to harm you today, but will be up and able to kill you tomorrow, then that's not sufficient. So the notion of incapacitation, if it's going to have any real role in this, has got to be something like permanent incapacitation, taken out of the war somehow. And that, if you can do that by lobbing a gas canister over on the other troops, and then you go collect them all while they're unconscious and haul them off to a prisoner of war camp, then that's great. But if you lob the canister over there and then you continue fighting some other people, and then the other side retrieves all the unconscious ones and takes them back, and they get a good sleep and they're ready to come back tomorrow, then that's not sufficient. Okay. The other point I wanted to make was just to say that I think that what Kai said about the level of causal contribution to a threat being irrelevant was based, I think, on a misunderstanding of the illustrations that you gave. So you said, take the case of the boulder, I can't push it over, but both of us do. It takes two of us to get the boulder over so that it's going to crush you. And then you said that means each of us is contributing 50%. But I think that's not actually right. What you need to say there is that each one's contribution makes all the difference, since without it, nothing is going to happen at all. And so what you have to think of here is what would be prevented by killing one of these people. And it may well be true that only one of them is liable to be killed, and you can take your pick which one it is, but certainly one of them is going to be liable to be killed, because that's going to prevent the boulder from going on top of you. That'll be sufficient. The same thing is true if you've got 1,000 people pushing the boulder. If each one's contribution is necessary, then each one is liable to be killed, though it's a conditional liability. What that means is that each one is liable to be killed provided no other one has yet been killed. So if it takes 1,000 to get the boulder over and I've already killed one of them, the boulder can't be nudged by the other 999, then they're not liable. That's correct. But until one of them has been killed, each one of them is potentially liable to be killed.
So let me just say one brief thing to the point that Jeff made to me. So I agree in general with what you said. And in fact, this understanding of incapacitation extends into not just in human rights law, but in humanitarian law, and has been true for a long time. And it concerned that we should be focusing on, as you say, either capturing folks and turning them into POWs, or in making them order to combat in a way that they're not going to easily be able to come back. But we don't, in fact, train soldiers that way in most circumstances. And so that just, in a sense, works to my advantage in terms of what I'm trying to show. But I think you're right. We could start training soldiers differently. But that would make an enormous difference and not likely to happen into the foreseeable future, I don't think, and that's sort of what the contingent pacifist tends to need. But I agree that, especially the question about turning them into folks who are order to combat, it's just straightforward stuff out of the domestic criminal law statute. If you can stop your attacker by shooting the person in the kneecap, then that's what you should do. And if it's clear that instead you shot the person in the head, then you can't use self-defense as a justification. Yep. Okay.
Sam, it's time for another question. Actually, no, we don't have time.
Oh, well.
Okay, so that does it for today, and we hope to see you all tomorrow.